Right. Where we left off, I was talking about how all living things can be placed into three domains, eukaryotes or eukarya, either name is fine, where the cells contain these flexible sacs where genetic material is stored. That's the DNA. We'll talk a lot more about that stuff later. And eukaryote cells tend to be compartmentalized with many specialized compartments that carry out different functions. We call these organelles. They're analogous in a rough way to your body's organs. You know, different organs do different things in you. Different organelles carry out different metabolic functions in eukaryote cells. And then archaea and bacteria are the other two. Both of those we call prokaryotes because the cells don't have nuclei and don't really have compartments. They are very different from each other, but it's on the level of macromolecules. You're perfectly capable of understanding it, but we just don't have time. So this is one of those points where I wave my arms and say, just trust me, I've got a PhD. Archaea and bacteria are different. The only thing I really say about archaea is that many archaeans, although not all, live in extreme environments like this. This is like a hot spring, except it's not coming out on land. It's coming out at about 5,000 feet below the surface of the ocean. And what looks like smoke is actually pressurized, superheated water that's rich in minerals, specifically iron and sulfur. And there are thermophilic archaea that are perfectly happy living here at temperatures that are hotter than the temperature of boiling water on land would be. There are archaeans that would be happy living in a pressure cooker. That's pretty extreme. And again, critters that can do this sort of thing are called extremophiles. And not all archaeans are, but probably the most famous are the extremophilic archaeans. Okay, most bacteria are like most archaea in that they tend to be really small. And again, they don't have these compartmentalized cells with a nucleus and organelles. At most, they are a few millionths of a meter in size. By the way, a millionth of a meter is technically a micrometer, but that's usually abbreviated as micron. And in case you ever encounter this, the short way of writing micron looks like this. That thing that looks like a U with a tail over there on the right is the cursive version of the Greek letter mu, right? The capital mu looks like our letter M. If you're in a frat, I presume that you have had to learn the Greek alphabet. But the lowercase mu is written like that, and it looks like this U with a tail sticking off to the left. And that's the abbreviation for 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Most bacteria are, I'd say, roughly between maybe 1/2 and 5 microns in size. And even under the best light microscopes that you're going to get, most bacteria look like specks. This is the kind of thing you might see under a high-performance light microscope, even better than the ones that you're going to be using in an upcoming lab. And you can see these bacteria, each one of these little purple dots is one bacterium. Like that is a bacterium, that is a bacterium, that's a bacterium, and so on. Each one of those dots. That's the best that light microscopes can do. Most bacteria also are nearly transparent, and to see them, you have to hit them with a chemical dye. There are dyes that bacteria will take up to show them more clearly, and we call these stains. So most bacteria have to be stained to be examined. I used to work as a volunteer lab technician in the Berkeley Free Clinic in California. And I used to do this an awful lot on all sorts of things that come out of people's bodies to try to detect particular bacteria that they might have. Anybody who works in a medical laboratory will do an awful lot of staining. Classifying bacteria is a complicated business because with things that small, a lot of them look a great deal alike, but don't necessarily live in the same way. One of the features we do use is shape of the cells. So these are bacteria, they've been stained, they're not normally bright purple, but that's an individual bacterium that I've circled. Whoops, backwards one. That's one. You can see the individual cells look like little dots, and bacteria that are shaped like dots, or if you could see them even more close up, you'd see they're shaped like balls, like spheres, and we call those cocci, C-O-C-C-I, dot-shaped bacteria. The singular is a coccus, by the way. Rod-shaped bacteria, if you could see them in 3D, they would look like hot dogs, and they can be short or long. They can be stained in different ways, and they're called bacilli. So I asked my students, do you know the name of rod-shaped bacteria? And they said, don't bacilli. Right, okay. And then bacteria that are shaped like spirals, like little, pieces of a spring, are called spirilla. So those are some stained spirilla right there. Each of these things that looks like a little sine wave curve is an individual spirillum. Each one of those is one cell. Very short spirilla are called vibrios, and they tend to be shaped like little commas or like little beans. So that there is a very highly enlarged picture of a vibrio. By the way, the little S curve that's sticking out of it, that's not a spirillum. That's a structure that some bacteria have that they can swim with. It's called a bacterial flagellum. But yeah, the main body of the cell you can see is shaped kind of like a bean. That is a vibrio. By the way, very long spirilla are affectionately known as spirochetes. And this is a couple of them. You can see this below, that bacterium is extremely long. That little yellow bar is 10 microns long. And this bacterium looks to be, I'm guessing, about 10, 20, 30, 40, about 50 microns. It's about 5 of those yellow bars long. So that's really long for a bacterium. The bacterium that causes syphilis happens to be a spirochete. That's a sexually transmitted disease. So is the bacterium that causes Lyme disease, which you have to worry about here because you get it from the bite of an infected tick. If you get a tick bite and you start getting this kind of target-shaped rash around it, that is potentially very dangerous. Lyme disease can leave you with lasting effects if it's not treated early. So yeah, all the more reason not to get bitten by ticks if you can avoid it. If you do go outside, you might end up ticked off. Right, okay. You can go further with this and identify bacteria by how they group during growth. Bacteria reproduce by dividing. Each cell basically pinches in 2, and now you've got 2 cells. How they stick together as they're dividing gives bacteria different clusters of bacteria, different shapes in different groups of bacteria. These are cocci, of course, because they're shaped like little dots, and they're growing in these bunches that reminded somebody of a bunch of grapes. The Greek for a bunch of grapes happens to be staphylos, and these are staphylococci. They're cocci that grow in bunches like grapes. I've said it before, but I'll remind you, I will never test you on the meanings of Greek and Latin words. I'll never ask you, what does staphylos mean in Greek? But I give you these meanings because sometimes it helps people remember what the words mean if you know that they have a meaning beyond just being some combination of letters that people threw together. So these are staphylococci, often abbreviated staph. If you've ever heard of someone having a staph infection, they were infected with particular species of staphylococci. The one that you have to worry about because you can get it in places like locker rooms is MRSA, multi-drug resistant Staphylococcus aureus. MRSA looks basically like this. If you could take some like out of somebody's pustule and stain it and put it on a microscope slide, this is pretty much what you would see. Bacteria that grow in pairs are called diplococci. Like right there, that's a pair of little cocci. So is that, that's a pair. That's actually two pairs. I can't remember if that beats, if two pairs beats a full house or not. Diplo happens to be Greek for double. So cocci that tend to come in pairs, these double cocci look like that. I mentioned that I used to work as a volunteer lab tech in the Berkeley Free Clinic. We used to look for diplococci a lot in the discharge coming out of men's penises. I looked at an awful lot of that stuff under the microscope, and we're looking for diplococci because gonorrhea happens to be caused by a diplococcus. If we found diplococci in a stained slide of penile discharge, well, we'd know it was gonorrhea and we treat with one set of drugs. If we didn't, it was probably chlamydia and we'd treat with a different set of drugs. So this stuff can definitely is used practically every day by medical laboratory technicians. Oh, we didn't do this at the Berkeley Free Clinic, but if you pick these up in spinal fluid, it's bacterial meningitis. The bacterium that causes bacterial meningitis, which is also a disease that can spread in dorms and places like that. That bacterium is also a diplococcus. And lab techs might be looking for these in somebody's spinal fluid. Although at the Free Clinic, we didn't handle that. And then finally, if cocci grow in chains, we call them streptococci, and streptos happens to mean twisted, because streptococci look like they are growing in chains or, you know, making ropes, looking kind of like that soap on a rope that my mom had when I was about 7. If you've ever had strep throat is short for streptococcus. A throat infection caused by particular species of streptococcus is strep throat. That's where that word comes from. Okay, that's about as much as we can see with microscopes that use light. If you want more detail, we have to move on to gizmos called electron microscopes. Here at UCA, we've got one type of microscope called a scanning electron microscope that several of our faculty use. This picture was taken by what's called a transmission electron microscope. And to use one of those, you'd either have to go to UALR or UAMS. We don't have a transmission EM at UCA. But electron microscopes can magnify millions of times. They can get much more detail than light microscopes can. And if you take a bacterium and slice it in half and look at it under a transmission EM, this is what you see. Like all cells, bacterial cells are surrounded by a flexible outer covering that keeps the insides in and the outsides out. I'm outlining it in red right now. That's called the cell membrane. Most bacteria, although not all, have a stiffer coating outside of the cell membrane. You could make a bacterial model by taking a big water balloon and stuffing it into a cardboard box. The water would be the contents of the cell. The balloon would be the cell membrane. And outside of the cell membrane, there's a stiffer outer covering that is what makes the bacterium keep its shape. And that's called the cell wall. So let me highlight that for you real quick if I can find the controls. Yeah. So this thing that I'm highlighting in yellow, I don't know if I'll be able to go all the way around, but that is the cell wall outside of the cell membrane. You'll see cell walls in several different groups of organisms. Bacteria are not the only ones that have them. Cell walls in bacteria are made of a substance called peptidoglycan, which is spelled like this. Different types of bacteria have different structures of cell walls. We don't need to get into that, although it can be very important for how we treat bacteria. But usually a cell wall of a bacterium includes at least some of a protein compound mix called peptidoglycan. And the reason anybody who's not a complete nerd would care about this is that your cells don't make peptidoglycan. Antibiotics like penicillin and others you might have heard of that are chemically related to penicillin, like amoxicillin, ampicillin, cephalosporins, they work by blocking bacteria from making peptidoglycan. So a bacterium that's been hit with a penicillin antibiotic can't grow and it can't reproduce because it's blocked from expanding its cell wall. And this is what makes antibiotics of the penicillin family very safe. Human cells don't make peptidoglycan, so penicillin will leave your cells alone and kill the bacteria that you're infected with. This was a major lifesaver in the Second World War. That's where this poster dates from, by the way. And after the war, it came into civilian use and was hailed as a wonder drug. Now, these days, there are a lot of bacteria that can resist penicillin, but we will actually talk about that later as to how that happened. But anyway, that's a generally good principle of drug design. You try to find some feature of metabolism that your cells don't use, but the organisms that you're trying to kill do use, and then you target your drugs to interfere with that. So you'll kill infecting bacteria or viruses and leave the healthy cells standing, or at least that's the theory behind it. And people work, that's very much an active area of research. Anyway, this might seem like trivia, but this is a point I'm actually going to come back to. Oh, I have a question about someone who is allergic to penicillin. I'll talk about allergies about 3/4 of the way through. Let me hold that question and I'll get to that in good time. We've got that coming up. Okay, right. This is also something I'm going to come back to about halfway through. Some bacteria outside the cell wall have an extra layer, and it's a layer of slime. These bacteria have been stained with a stain that colors the bacterium. That's the actual bacteria right there. And these look like either bacilli or actually these might be diplococci, but it's kind of hard to tell. But that's the actual bacterium. And surrounding it, you have this halo right there. That halo is a thick slime layer, and we call that the capsule. And one reason why this matters is that this can be important in determining whether the bacterium is infective or not. Bacteria that cause a severe lung infection, pneumonia, if those bacteria can make a capsule, they can cause severe illness. If they don't make a capsule, they can be cleaned up by your body's defenses very quickly, and they generally don't make you sick. There's another reason why that capsule is important, and I'm going to come back to it about halfway through. So for now, know that some bacteria have this layer of snot outside the cell wall, and it's called a capsule. And why that matters, we'll come back to. All right, when bacteria reproduce, it's typically by splitting in two. This is a slice through a bacterium that was caught in the act. Those light-colored areas are two clumps of DNA. We'll talk later about what DNA does, but it's responsible for heredity. And there and there, you can see this is called a cleavage furrow. That's just the point where the cells are pinching in two. And when that furrow pinches all the way through, we will have two cells, each with its own clump of DNA. So this is a bacterium caught in the act of reproducing. There's also a form of sexual reproduction called conjugation that bacteria can engage in. I don't really have time to say more about that, except to point out that bacteria do in fact have sex. Bacteria can be smaller than 1 micron and still reproduce sexually. So seen from the point of view of all of life, size really does not matter. Right, bad professor, no cookie, don't make that joke, bad professor. Okay. Some bacteria can form resistant structures inside themselves called endospores. Over there on the left, those are bacilli, long bacilli, and some of them you can see have kind of a swelling and a bright spot on one end. Microbiologists sometimes call these tennis rackets. Like if you look at that one right there, you can see that at one end, the cell gets wider and there's this white spot. Over here on the right, these are bacteria that have white spots developing in the middle of the cell. What those are very thick-walled capsules. The bacterium can just stick its DNA and a few other things into one of these capsules. The capsule can break out of the cell, and the capsules can withstand almost anything for years in suspended animation. This is one of the things that makes the definition of what life is kind of fuzzy, because bacterial endospores can sit there for years and seemingly be dead, and then come back to life whenever conditions improve. Sorry, I'm just having a mental image of one of these little bacterial endospores singing, "Bring me to life, wake me up inside, wake me up inside." This is Arkansas. You're supposed to know that song. That's probably the best known rock song ever to come out of Little Rock. Okay, I see. All right, I see that Evanescence has a couple of fans. Okay. Well, yeah, these endospores can, can be brought to life. Look, Ian, it's just Amy Lee just is kind of a little out of my range. Okay, I'm not an operatic mezzo soprano. I am what I am. Some Philistines, right? Okay. And the reason you might have heard of this is that the endospores of one particular species of bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, if that bacterium gets into cuts in your skin, you get these black pustules on your skin called anthrax. If you get this bacterium in your lungs, you die very quickly from massive infection. And Bacillus anthracis is one of the bacteria that can make these endospores, and the endospores can be prepared as a biological weapon. They just look like a white powder if they've been prepared properly, but breathing in any of that white powder will kill you in something like 48 hours. And I realize now that this is before your time, because this was almost 20 years ago. But in the aftermath of September 2001, politicians and media outlets started getting envelopes containing endospores, which look like a fine white powder. You rip open an envelope, all of this white powder flies into the air, and 22 people got sick, 5 of them died. I believe that was later traced. They tried to make it look like it was Al-Qaeda, but it was actually a disgruntled and probably not mentally well bacteria specialist working for the Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is where our military does research into biological warfare. We've never used it in combat. And I frankly hope that continues because it's a very difficult weapon to control, but the military does do research on how this is done and how to counteract it. Right. The reason all of this stuff matters is that all of these features of bacteria, the shape, the size, the growth form, meaning do they grow in chains or clumps or single or pairs or what have you, all of those are used to identify pathogens. A pathogen is anything that causes disease. So many bacteria are pathogens. Viruses are also pathogens. So are parasites. All of these things that cause symptoms are pathogens. If it helps, pathos is Greek for suffering, and gen is the same as generate, to produce, to give birth to. So pathogens are something that generate suffering. So syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia are caused by bacteria. So is Lyme disease. So is cholera. So is food poisoning, strep throat, MRSA, impetigo, which is this skin infection that little kids tend to get when they scratch themselves, tetanus, diphtheria, tuberculosis. Lots and lots of diseases are caused by bacteria. And we have to, as far as I know, no archaean causes disease to anybody. But we have to be able to identify bacteria in human patients, in veterinary patients, in samples of food and water. Your water has to get tested every so often for the presence of bacteria in it. Ditto for food samples, sewage and things like that. All of these, you have to be able to identify bacteria. Often it's not that the bacteria cause illness, it's that the bacteria produce toxins. Bacteria produce substances that are poisonous that can spread through the body. There are some bacteria where there is just a part of the bacterium itself that is inherently toxic. Salmonella, for example, is a very severe gastrointestinal disease. And it's caused because you have salmonella bacteria growing in your intestine, and they're simply a part of the bacterium itself that acts like it's a toxin, that acts like it's poisoning you. So yeah, if you ever get a salmonella infection, you can say to your bacteria, "You're toxic. I'm in love, but you're toxic." That was that Britney Spears song where she's like an airline stewardess pole dancing past laser tripwires or something like that. Anyway, right. Exotoxins are toxic substances that the bacteria release as they grow, and they leave the bacterial cells and can spread throughout your entire body. Tetanus will do this. Botulism, a very severe type of food poisoning, makes you sick because of that. Staph infections, diphtheria, anthrax, these are all bacteria that make toxic substances that leave the bacteria themselves and can spread through your whole body. And you do not want this to happen. This is a painting of a British soldier who's dying of tetanus. Now, you get tetanus usually when they enter your skin through a wound or a scratch. If you step on a dirty nail or get scratched by dirty barbed wire or something like that, what can happen is that the bacterium that causes this disease, Clostridium tetani, gets under your skin into your tissues, and it starts growing and feeding and reproducing. The problem is that as it grows, it starts making tetanus toxin that circulates through the entire body. This poor guy dying of tetanus might only have the bacteria growing maybe in one place. Maybe it's on his foot or something like that. But the toxin that those bacteria are making has spread everywhere. And what that toxin does is keep your muscles from relaxing. The first sign is usually that your jaw clenches shut and can't open. That's why tetanus is also called lockjaw. But in this case, basically every muscle in his body is contracting. None of them can relax. And this is very likely to be fatal. It's still, even with modern medical care, this is still a very dangerous situation to be in. Once you've got full-blown tetanus like this, that's intensive care for weeks with maybe a 50-50 chance of survival. Good reason to get a tetanus shot. I'm just saying here, because it's pretty easy to get tetanus. So that's an example of an exotoxin. Another one, there's a closely related bacterium to the tetanus bacterium. It's in the same genus, Clostridium botulinum. Now, with Clostridium botulinum, you often get that by eating contaminated food. Clostridium botulinum is one of the few bacteria that can grow inside canned food, which is why you should never eat food out of a can if the can is bulging or otherwise misshapen. That is potentially very dangerous. And it's dangerous because Clostridium botulinum exotoxin can also spread through your body and paralyzes muscles. Oddly enough, though, it's actually got a medical use because you can inject this stuff. Basically, the drug companies grow lots of Clostridium botulinum bacteria and extract the exotoxin. They sell it under the name Botox. And you can deliberately inject Botox into muscles that you want to temporarily paralyze. So this can be a cosmetic procedure. People with facial wrinkles can temporarily make the wrinkles go away by paralyzing their facial muscles, which of course means that they have no facial expressions and look like a freaking Barbie, but you know, better that than wrinkles, right? My grandmother actually used to get Botox injections because she had this condition. The medical name is blepharospasm. It made her eyelid muscles twitch uncontrollably. She couldn't hold her eyes open. It looked like she was uncontrollably, rapidly blinking. And, you know, she would have been essentially blind, except we found doctors that would inject Botox directly into those muscles, and that would enable her to hold her eyes open. And she had at least 20 more years of driving around town, taking meals to elderly shut-ins who were 20 years younger than she was, thanks to Botox injections. So there are times when you can use this medically for reasons other than cosmetic reasons. But a big disclaimer here, the vast majority of bacteria don't cause disease. There's a fairly limited number that do. And the truth is that it's really not our planet Earth. It's basically the bacteria planet, and we just pay rent, because bacteria are everywhere you can think of. There are bacterial spores floating through the air, in a building, outside of a building, makes no difference. There's bacteria in every source of water that has not been deliberately purified. There's enormous amounts of bacteria in the soil. There's bacteria living on plants. There are bacteria in your mouth. There are so many bacteria in your intestine that roughly half of each bowel movement is bacteria. That's a fact you probably did not really want to know, but hey, I'm a teacher. You know, I teach whether people want to know things or not. That's how many bacteria you've got living in your intestine. You have something, I think last they tried, they found something like 160 different species of bacteria living on your skin. There's bacteria in your mouth. There are bacteria in your vagina if you've got one. That, be it said, are important for staying healthy. They're not making you sick. They actually defend your gut, your mouth, your vagina, if you've got one, against other bacteria that could cause illness. They're necessary for your health. So bacteria live everywhere you can think of. Many bacteria have to have oxygen to live, and bacteria that require oxygen are called aerobic. You can always tell aerobic bacteria because they're the ones that put on leg warmers and go, and one, and two, and one, and two, and one, and two. Okay, just kidding. Do people still do aerobics, or is it all Zune and that dance craze? Never mind, don't need to know. There's other bacteria that don't need oxygen, and many of them may even be poisoned by it, and those are called anaerobic. Zumba, that's it. Okay, Zumba, not Zune, that's something else. So bacteria that are killed by oxygen would be anaerobic. Even in your body, many of the bacteria living in you are anaerobic, because even though your body needs oxygen, there are lots of places like inside your intestines or in the little nooks and crannies in your mouth. There's lots of little places where oxygen doesn't really reach. So other places that don't have oxygen include places like stinky pond mud. If you've ever like dug a little mud off the bottom of a pond and noticed that it smelled kind of rotten egg, that's an anaerobic zone. Many bacteria are what we call decomposers. I'll have a lot more to say about decomposers at the very end of the course, but they make a living by breaking down dead organisms. Dead animals and dead plants don't stick around and end up filling our forests. They rot and eventually just disappear. That's largely done by bacteria, sometimes with help from other types of organisms like fungi, which we may not get to today. And as decomposers do their work, breaking down the dead, they ultimately release the elements that those dead things were made of back into the environment for other living things to use. The dead leaves on the floor of a forest break down because of bacteria and a second group of organisms called fungi that we haven't talked about yet. And they break down because of bacteria, because of decomposers, and they crumble. And ultimately the CHNOPS, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, that used to make up those leaves gets released back into the soil, the water, and the air, and a new generation of plants can take those and use it again. Nothing is ever really wasted. We call that nutrient cycling or nutrient recycling. Very, very important for life on Earth. Life as we know it wouldn't exist if we did not have decomposers. And there's a lot of bacteria that are beneficial. Bacteria used in the food industry. If you take milk and you inoculate it with the right strain of bacterium, a bacterium called Lactobacillus acidophilus, those bacteria break down the sugar in the milk and create lactic acid, and the milk becomes less sweet, more sour, and thicker, and you get buttermilk, you get yogurt with slightly different bacteria, you get kefir, if you know what that is. It's a sour milk drink that I see sold as a health food. You get sour cream that way. You get sourdough bread, if you've ever had that. That's produced by bacteria growing in the bread dough that give it a distinctive flavor that is very nice. Bacteria can take wine, cider, or beer and convert it to vinegar. So if you have ever gone grocery shopping and looked carefully at the vinegar, they'll sell you wine vinegar or malt vinegar, which is made out of beer, or cider vinegar, which is made out of alcoholic apple cider. So, you know, those are food products right there that depend on bacteria. Bacteria can be deliberately added to cheese to give it particular flavors. So, for example, there's special bacteria that are added to provolone cheese, and they break down the fat in provolone cheese, and the waste products give provolone its flavor. The same is true for Swiss cheese. The bacteria added to Swiss cheese don't only give it its flavor, they make gas bubbles, which is why Swiss cheese has holes in it. Like kombucha, I think kombucha is mostly produced by fungi, which are different from bacteria. Honestly, I'd have to look that up. Thank you for, here, I'll keep reading the slide while I check this on my phone, because I've got the sum total of human knowledge here. Anyway, there's other bacteria that can break sugars down into a food additive called xanthan gum. Xanthan gum tends to get added to gluten-free flour because when you make bread, gluten is the stuff that makes the dough sticky and makes the bread chewy. And if you take that away from your flour, your product is going to be kind of crumbly and crunchy, and it's not going to have the same texture as bread. But xanthan gum can add as a substitute. Kombucha is mostly made from a mixture of bacteria and yeast are not bacteria, they're fungi. So yeah, there are bacteria involved in kombucha, but there's other critters, these yeast, that also are involved in making kombucha. Okay. Moving away from food, bacteria break down wastes in sewage treatment. A sewage treatment plant is basically a giant bacteria farm with bacteria breaking down everything that gets flushed down toilets or sinks and breaking it down into harmless products in the sludge. And then that's separated and the sludge sinks to the bottom and the water is now cleaned and can be released. There are varieties of bacteria that can break down crude oil. They've been used to clean up oil spills. There's other bacteria that can extract minerals from the rubble produced by mining. So you can get valuable metals that way. This is the roots of a soybean plant, and there's these lumps on them. Those lumps are formed by bacteria that live inside the plant roots. And this is not making the plant sick. In fact, it is these bacteria that take nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere, right out of the air, and convert it into a form that the plant can use. All living things require nitrogen. There's tons of nitrogen in the air. The air you're breathing is what, like 78% nitrogen. But nitrogen gas is a very difficult for living things to make use of. And some of the few living things that can take nitrogen gas and turn it into a biologically available form are these bacteria that live inside the roots of legumes. Legumes, by the way, is not just soybeans, but it's all beans, peas, clover, alfalfa, wisteria flowers, things, mesquites. They're all in a plant family called the legumes. And this actually increases soil fertility. Organic farmers will sometimes plant a field with clover and just let it grow and then plow it under. And that restores fertility to the soil because other plants need to have that nitrogen if they're gonna grow. And again, as I mentioned, there are thousands of bacterial species living in a healthy human body. And there's research being done on what these bacteria do, but you can already get foods and supplements with healthy bacteria added. This supplement right here, you can see it replenishes good bacteria to promote overall digestive health. And these are called probiotics. And yes, what you are taking if you take a probiotic supplement is bacteria that hopefully will colonize your gut and do good things for you, like help you lose weight or strengthen your immune system or otherwise make you healthy. I have not really done any research on how useful these are. When I talk about some medical development, please do not take this as medical advice. I mean, I have a PhD, so I can call myself Dr. Wagoner, but I'm not the kind of doctor that does people any good. I'm the kind of Dr. Wagoner that talks an awful lot to people who are falling asleep. So I will make no recommendation as to whether probiotics are a good thing to take or not. But that is a context in which you might encounter bacteria being used today in ways that hopefully will benefit human health. So there. Okay, we still got 20 minutes. Hang on. You know, keep your, stay awake, slam you some coffee. I'm going to keep going all the way to the end. Bacteria and eukarya are both what we call prokaryotes. All of the other critters that we're going to talk about have nuclei in their cells. What you're looking at here is a slice through a human white blood cell. You are a eukaryote because your cells contain nuclei. And all of this thing that I'm highlighting right now, that's blotchy and shaped kind of like a very fat letter U, all of this and all of the stuff inside it, that is the nucleus of a human white blood cell. So all of that I'm shading in is a nucleus. And outside the nucleus, you can see lots of little, look like bubbles and blibs and blobs and bits and bobs and boops and bleeps. And clearly I cannot speak intelligently and color in at the same time. Anyway, that's the nucleus, and surrounding the nucleus inside the cell, you can see lots of organelles. So like that is one, and that is one, and that is one. All of these little dots are organelles of various kinds. So that's a fairly typical eukaryote cell. There's the nucleus. For our purposes in this class, we're going to learn about 4 kingdoms of eukaryotes. The animalia are the true animals. You are in the kingdom Animalia. You're animals, among other things. The true plants go in the Plantae, easy enough to remember so far. The third kingdom is kingdom Fungi. The best known members of the kingdom Fungi are mushrooms, although there's certainly lots of others. Everything from yeasts to the stuff that causes athlete's foot are fungi. And these 3 are mostly multicellular. The bodies are made up of many cells. The simplest animals I can think of might be made up of fewer than 1,000 cells. Your body, on average, the average human's estimated at being made of 37 trillion cells, last I checked. Although it depends on how large you are. And it's not a fixed number because cells in your body are constantly dying and being regenerated. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, you average about 37 trillion cells, whereas very simple animals might contain about 1,000. Plants, it's about the same. Fungi, well, fungi are kind of gray because there are some fungi that aren't really multicellular, but this will kind of work for what we're doing here. And these 3 also show some degree of cell differentiation, which just means that you're made of different types of cell that are specialized to do different things. Those 37 trillion cells that make up you fall into roughly 200 different cell types. The cells that produce insulin in your pancreas look and act differently from the Purkinje cells in your cerebellum that coordinate your movements. And those look different from the columnar epithelial cells in your lungs that line your air passages and produce mucus to trap dust so you can cough it out. And there's about 197 more. If you ever take a class in what's called histology, you get to learn all of them. So this is also true in plants. This is kind of true in fungi, arm wave, arm wave. The 4th kingdom is the kingdom Protista. And again, the Protista is kind of where we put eukaryotes that don't fit into the Animalia, Plantae, or fungi. The Protista is what we call a wastebasket. It includes all eukaryotes that are not animals, not plants, and not fungi. Generally, they're either made of a single cell. This is a protist where the entire organism is just one cell. It's called paramecium. You might see it in an upcoming lab, or you might not. Or there are protists that are multi-celled but don't have much cell differentiation. but it's not really good practice to classify living things together based on what they don't have. A friend of mine in high school used to love confusing people by making jokes that didn't make any sense. And one of his jokes was, what do a bald eagle and a brick wall have in common? And the answer, of course, is neither one can drive a stick shift. Okay, I'm imagining all of you laughing uproariously. And from that joke, you can learn two things. One is that there's a lot of strange chemicals in the water in the town where I grew up. The other thing is that it really doesn't make sense to classify things as being similar based on features that they don't have, right? Bald eagles and brick walls, it's true, share the property of not being able to drive a stick shift, but that doesn't really mean that they're alike. And two different protists may share the property of not being multicellular or having cell differentiation, but be completely different in every other way that's out there. And so these days we divide the protista up into multiple kingdoms. If you have to know, you can major in this stuff and take Biology 4401, where we go into all of this in insane detail. For this class, you need to know that eukaryotes are animals, plants, fungi, and other. And the other group is sometimes called the kingdom protista, even though it's not really a very good way to classify living things. So this other group includes both single-celled organisms and multi-celled ones. Some of them harvest solar energy to power their metabolism like plants do, like these. This is a picture taken through a microscope of a single-celled protist called Chlamydomonas. Each one of these little green dots is a single cell, and they're green, which means they have the pigment chlorophyll, which lets them harvest sunlight. So those are protists. This is another protist that's made up of many cells, but the cells are strung together in a chain. So this box that I'm outlining right here is one cell. And when many of these cells grow together, it creates these filaments. If you've ever seen kind of stringy filament-like green scum on the surface of a pond, it was probably this or something like it. Inside each cell, this thing that looks like a big spiral is one of the organelles. It's called a chloroplast, and we'll talk about those later. And this is a protist because it's made of many cells, but the cells are all identical. There's no cellular differentiation. So yeah, this over here is another cell. That over there, whoops, is another cell. They're lined up in a filament. And the genus name for this is Spirogyra, by the way, which was also the name of a really good jazz fusion band in the 70s. Seaweeds often get put in the protista. They look like plants, but they don't have much cellular differentiation. They kind of have some. Again, this is not really a good way to classify things, and there are better ways, but we just don't have time to cover them. And protists can make a living in any one of a huge number of ways. Some of them are autotrophic. And this is a word you'll see again, by the way. Troph is the Greek root meaning to feed. Auto is yourself. So an automobile moves by itself, right? And an autotroph feeds by itself. They're able to take in energy from the sun and use that energy to power their metabolism, building up large molecules from small molecules like carbon dioxide. Plants do this, but many protists can do it as well. Many protists are autotrophic, The common name for an autotrophic protist is an alga, plural algae. Many other protists are heterotrophic. Hetero means other or different. Heterotrophs means feed on others. They run their metabolism by eating things, breaking down their large molecules and extracting energy from the process, like animals do, like you do. When you eat your Big Mac, you're eating a big collection of macromolecules, carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and all that. And you get your energy by breaking them down into their components. And then you can use their components to build up macromolecules that you need to be made of. So you can break down the proteins in a hamburger and use the breakdown products to build the proteins that you have to have in your own muscles. That's heterotrophy. Animals typically do this. And the common name for heterotrophic protists, you'll still see them sometimes called protozoa. And then there's some protists that can actually switch hit, that can eat other things and carry out photosynthesis. They can either switch from one to the other, or they might do both at the same time. And these are called mixotrophic protists. And this is one. This is a picture taken under a microscope of a cell that I would guess is about 60, 70 microns long. It belongs to the genus Euglena, its species Euglena gracilis. You can't see it clearly in this picture, but it's actually got a little hair-like organelle that it uses to swim. And these green dots are where Euglena carries out photosynthesis. That's where it harvests sunlight, but it's also got a mouth up here. You can't clearly see it, but I promise you it's there, that can open and can swallow other living things. So this thing actively swims, and if there's no light present, it can eat other living things. So it can be either an autotroph or a heterotroph. So it's a great example of a mixotroph, which makes me think it ought to like have a career as a rapper, with songs like, I like sunlight, no, I cannot lie. You other protists can't deny, but sometimes I eat other things too because I don't know what to do. There could be something there. Sir Mixotroph. Did I just do that? Well, dang. Okay, right. Very important in the environment because a lot of protists float in oceans or lakes, and they make up a large portion of what we call the phytoplankton. Plankton is not that little thing that looks like an animated vitamin pill that owns the Krusty Krab. Plankton is used for organisms that float and can't swim, or at least can't swim well enough to determine where they're going in the water. And plankton that's autotrophic is called phytoplankton. Phyto is a Greek word for a plant. So the plant-like plankton is phytoplankton. Phytoplankton gets eaten by free-floating heterotrophs called zooplankton, animal floaters. And zooplankton includes a lot of heterotrophic protists as well as very tiny animals. And the reason this matters is this is ultimately what life in the ocean depends on, is free-floating phytoplankton soaking up solar energy and using that to build macromolecules. And then the phytoplankton gets grazed by the zooplankton. The zooplankton gets grazed by the little fish, and the little fish get grazed by the big fish, and the big fish gets eaten by the tuna, and the tuna gets eaten by you in a sandwich, and it's all there because of the phytoplankton. So floating photosynthetic protists, and also photosynthetic bacteria, be it said, are the foundation of life in the oceans. Without them, there would be nothing. No tuna sandwiches, no nothing. Everything depends on them. We'll look at that in more detail at the very end of the course when I talk about food webs and trophic pyramids. There are other protists that cause deadly human and animal disease. These are both pictures taken through a microscope of stained human blood. On the left, these are blood cells, these almost perfectly round things. And in and among them, you have these little squiggly things that have kind of bent themselves into an S shape. Those are protists. You can actually see a nucleus in the middle. They belong to the genus Trypanosoma. They cause African sleeping sickness. Related protists cause a disease called Kala Azar. Related ones cause a disease called Chagas disease. And then on the right, these are stained human blood cells, and some of them contain little things inside them that look like little rings, like that, or like that, or like that. Those protists in the genus Plasmodium cause human malaria. Malaria is not a huge problem here. We get a few cases in Arkansas, but it's something like 10 per year, and it is treatable pretty well. But malaria globally kills something on the order of 400,000 people every year. It is globally one of the killers, one of the big threats to human health. For various reasons, it's not easy to treat. There's no vaccine for it. That's one of the things that Bill Gates is spending an awful lot of his money on, is working towards cures for malaria. And that's a protist. And there's even others. I'm almost done. This is the last slide. There's others that cause diseases of plants. On the left is a protist called Phytophthora infestans. Phytophthora infects something like 200 different crop plants. And starting in 1845, a particularly nasty Phytophthora infestans attacked the potato crop in Ireland. The worst year for it, they still call Black 47. 1847 was the worst year. Something like 1 million Irish people starved and died. Over 1 million more emigrated. Some of you, if you've got Irish ancestry, they may well have come to the United States as a consequence of the potato famine, and it's all caused by a protist. So very important group here. I will now stop the recording, and I'm stopping it now.